Jude verse 7 begins in a similar way. In other words, there is this connection between the previous verses. As we've said already during this series on the book of Jude, that we can't take verses in isolation, but we have to see the big picture of what the scripture is teaching us. And so in a similar way tells us that there is this connection, there's a link between what we read in verse 7 and what we read previously. This idea of judgment, the most graphic example of judgment in the Bible when we refer to Sodom and Gomorrah, and its impact is felt right throughout the scriptures. Constant references in the Old Testament right the way through into the New Testament, and what it's talking to us there is not just homosexual sin, which of course it is very specific there in this example, but also in a wider sense sexual sin. God is not anti-sex. That is something that people believe. People think God is some sort of a prude. No, God is not anti-sex at all, but rather that sex takes place within the confines of the relationship order that he is set in place in scripture. And when we go beyond that, we complicate things because we're then living outside the order that God has set into place. 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 18, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a man commits are outside his body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. So we see there, and that is a good verse, not picking it out to take it in isolation, but endorsed by the rest of scripture. That is a good verse that in a nutshell encapsulates the teaching on sexual sin, that it is to be avoided, that if we keep our lives pure, we keep our lives less complicated and stress-free than if we start going down the road of making them very messed up and muddled through the various things that we get ourselves involved with. To really understand Jude 7, because it talks about Sodom and Gomorrah, then we need to go back to the Old Testament, to the book of Genesis and Genesis 19, where we look at Lot as the central figure, and going back even before there to Genesis 13, because things don't go wrong on day one. Things go wrong or begin to get set in place way before. So the moment something happens, it isn't that it just started there. It probably took root many days, weeks, months, even years before. Like an affair. An affair doesn't just happen from nothing to an affair within 5 seconds. It's probably over a period of days, weeks, even months, where people's minds have been affected, where people have been drawn into certain relationships that ultimately cause nothing but destruction and mayhem and chaos and wreck people's lives. And so we see in Genesis 13, Abraham and Lot separate, and he tells us that Lot pitched his tents near Sodom. The obvious choice in life is not always right. We have a saying, don't we, that not all that glitters is gold. And so when we make choices in life, the one that seems obvious, that seems attractive, is actually not always the right choice to make. I remember once seeing a nature program. It was a foreign land somewhere, not a British one. It was a foreign land somewhere, and there was a particular flower that looked like a very beautiful flower, and so insects came in to land on this flower, and actually it was a spider. So the moment they landed on it, it got hold of them, and that was the end of the insect. Proverbs 14, there is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. And then as we move on, Lot pitched his tents near Sodom. It tells us that the men of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. The alarm bells should have been ringing, shouldn't they, for Lot? He should have been aware of this. He pitched his tents near to Sodom, and he tells us there of the heart attitude and the actual way the people lived their lives in Sodom. But the alarm bells should have been ringing, and they weren't. And that's why we need to be switched on to be dialed in to what's going on in our life, things start to get a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe we start to feel feelings for someone that we shouldn't be feeling those things towards. Maybe our heart starts to get softened towards a particular person. Those are alarm bells, and we need to pick up on those, and we need to nip those things in the bud, because if we don't, the chances are that we get involved and it ruins our marriages, it ruins our relationships, kids get affected, our wider family gets affected, and all sorts of folks get drawn in because we go down a path that we should not be going down in the first place. And that path doesn't start on day one, as I've already said. It can start many days, weeks, months, even years before, where we start to get drawn in, and then it kicks in and we start to actually walk that path, which ultimately is a path that very often leads to nothing but misery, heartbreak and disaster. And notice as well, Genesis 13, Lot pitched his tents near Sodom. Genesis 14 verse 12, exactly one chapter later, Lot was living in Sodom. He was living in Sodom. What a ridiculous situation. The Bible tells us in 2 Peter that Lot was a righteous man. And yet here he was, not only living near to Sodom, but now he was actually living in the city. He chose to live there. No one forced him. Like the decisions we make in life, no one makes us do those things. We choose those things ourselves. He started off outside the city, and now he was living in it. Compromise leads to complacency. Don't compromise your life. Stand firm to the things that you know to be true, because if we start to compromise, complacency sets in, and then when complacency sets in, the door is open to all manner of destructive practices and ideas and values coming into our lives that will very quickly ruin us. In 1820, Genesis 18 and verse 20, the Lord visits Abraham. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sins are so grievous. God's judgment against sin. God will always judge sin. Just because we commit a sin on the Monday and it hasn't been dealt with by the Tuesday, it doesn't mean to say that it's not to be dealt with. And that's why we need to bear that in mind. We never get away with anything as far as God is concerned. And that's why we need to live in such a place so that the actions, the decisions that we take in life are ones that lead to holiness and righteousness rather than selfishness, and ones that will lead to destruction. By the time we reach chapter 19 in Genesis verse 5, the angels visit Lot in Sodom, and the men of the city gather around. Where are these men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them. And that's where we see the word Sodom. That's where it comes from there in the scripture, used to describe that sort of practice that we read about there. And we see that Lot even offered his daughters. He offered his daughters to the people to appease them so that they would leave the visitors, his guests, alone. We see how Lot himself had become polluted by Satan, a righteous man. And yet living in the midst of Sodom, his values had been affected and he'd become polluted. And the only way to deal with sexual sin, I believe, is what we read in Genesis 39 when Joseph ran away from Potiphar's wife. He didn't embrace, he didn't go down the road, he just turned the other way and he ran the opposite direction. But Lot had gone to live in Sodom, and by now he's fully immersed in it himself. And that is the warning that we find in this verse, or this portion of scripture, because it's not just Jude verse 7, it's everything around it. The warning is that when we take the road of compromise leads to complacency, and then of course complacency leads to destruction and an open door for any values that will come into our lives from the world around us.